Amen. Well, this summer I went with my family on vacation to Hot Springs, Arkansas. Has anybody ever been there? Okay. And actually dipped my toe in the hot spring. It was quite hot. And went to Hot Springs, Arkansas. And in preparation for this trip, we wanted to build some anticipation with our children. And so we got them each a gift. Actually got them quite a nice gift. And for my son Hudson, his gift was an iPad. Yeah, I know. Pretty amazing. I could use one of those. So I don't even have an iPad. So got my son an iPad. And so we were excited because, sometimes I think as a parent, you're like, man, I feel like I'm disciplining so much. It's just nice to just bless them. And so we were so excited about, each gift that we were going to be giving the kids. And there was also a little bit of context, too, because some years prior, I got my boy Hudson, he had a refurbished Android tablet. Okay, it refurbished, and so it was already barely working when I bought it. But I'm like, just suck it up, boy, and get over it. Here's your time, And so he'd been just dealing with it, and it was getting worse and worse and worse through each year. So I knew he was just going to be so excited about this. So there's a little bit of context. The other little bit of context was that Hudson was, despite the dysfunctionality of the other refurbished, used, breaking down tablet, he had managed to achieve an incredible achievement, which was he made it to level 10 in a game called Clash of Clans. It's a video game called Clash of Clans. So he was, you know that game, don't you? And so he made it to level 10. He was very proud of this. So that all sets the stage for the ceremony of the giving of these gifts. And I made it kind of like a ridiculously big deal. I came out dancing, presenting these gifts. You can almost picture it. It was just like that. And so I come out and I make it this big deal. And I come out dancing with an iPad. And I'm like, and here you go. And Hudson is not excited at all. And I'm like, what's the matter, boy? And he goes, can you transfer the progress on Clash of Clans from the Android to the tablet? I'm like, come on, boy, this is a stinking iPad. I don't even care or know. I don't know if you can do that. Well, this is why Hudson gets so many sermon stories. He's the feeler of the family. Anybody, you families out there, anybody got the feeler in the family? You know what I'm talking about? He's so emotive. I mean, he's just beating his chest and staring into the heaven. What calamity hath befallen me? Or something like that. I mean, he is going crazy. And you can picture me. I'm coming to this I was so happy to give you this. So I did what any reasonable parent would do in that moment. I said, okay, you're not getting the iPad now. And so he starts freaking out all the more. And I'm like, what do you even want? And so, now, for the record, I'm only a little bit cruel. I did eventually give him the iPad, but it was only after weeks of maintaining a meticulous gratitude journal for his incredible parents and all the blessings in his life. So I'm not going to raise entitled children. And so eventually I did give him the iPad. But this whole scene that I described plays out in our lives, in the lives of many families. I'm not talking about the battle over electronics. I'm talking about the battle between reality and what we choose to be our defining reality. And when I talk about a defining reality, just to use the case of Hudson, I'm talking about what is foundational for your happiness in life. What's foundational? What are you staking it out on? Because in that little sort of microcosm of a story for Hudson, his happiness in that moment was based in Clash of Clans progress. And because of that, what happened was he had this incredible blessing right before his eyes, a brand new iPad, and he couldn't even appreciate it. And while we don't do that probably with Clash of Clans progress, we do it with other things. Just take a little gratitude test in your own life. Did you come to church grateful this morning? Did you come to church joyful and optimistic? And are you generally that way in life? Or is it that God has surrounded you with 1,001 blessings, and it's hard to notice them and appreciate them in the moment because you've staked your happiness on this thing that I must have, this earthly reality that's not worthy to be your defining reality, that thing that you stake your happiness in life on. What is your happiness in life staked on? What is that thing that you say, if I have that, then I'll be secure, then I'll be satisfied, then I'll be okay. Everything's going to work out. Everything's going to be if I get that. Because whatever that thing is, you can't be grateful for all the other stuff, and you'll find yourself living in this distorted reality where you're choosing refurbished, falling apart Androids over brand new iPads in your life. You'll find yourself overlooking and blind to the blessings of God, complaining to Him that He's not blessing you enough, and He's saying, but look. And so we're going to talk about reality today. Because I know you want to leave an eternal impact, an impact that goes beyond your days. And if you want to leave an eternal impact, you have to live in God's reality. The defining of your the reality of your life can't be an earthly reality, because the only thing worthy of defining your life is God, who is eternal. And so we're going to be in Acts chapter 25 and 26 this morning. Acts chapter 25 and 26, 2 chapters. You can see here the series that we're in is called Who's Who. And this sort of theme throughout this series is that the who's who of today is the who's that of tomorrow. And the who's that of today is the who's who of eternity. God sort of flips the script. And this is a study in the book of Acts on the life of the Apostle Paul, where he's testifying before the who's who of his day, the kings, the queens, the monarchs, the royal figures, the military leaders, etc. He's preaching before these people, and you start to see the way God sees things is very different from the way we tend to see things. So this particular story in Acts 25 and 26, there are a lot of characters in the story. If you ever read like a good fiction book, they typically like introduce all the characters at the beginning so you're not lost as you're going through. So before we open up the scripture and start actually looking and reading through some verses, I want to take a few moments and introduce you to the characters of the story of Acts 25 and 6, and really Acts 24 through Acts 26. Okay? Sound good? You ready to learn some new names? Maybe new names? Okay, so starting with a few weeks ago, actually, Acts chapter 24, here are our first two characters. Their names are Felix and Drusilla. Felix and Drusilla. And so we met them in chapters 24, and Drusilla was known as the most beautiful woman in Palestine. She was 19 years old at the time. Felix was her second husband, so she's married a second time at age 19. Her first husband, she actually left for Felix. Who's Felix? Felix was a governor over the region called Caesarea, about a day's journey west of Jerusalem. He was the governor, overseer of this region, married to Drusilla, this most beautiful woman in Palestine. And also, he was a murderer of thousands of people. He was known for being absolutely cruel and having zero morality or ethics of any kind. So that's Felix and Drusilla. Pleasant, isn't it? Okay, number two, we've got Festus, and this takes us into chapter 25. What we learn at the end of chapter 24 is that Felix, he's succeeded by this guy, Festus. Festus is the new guy in charge. We don't know a lot from history about Festus, apart from there are a few coins that have his face on them, and we have a few historical paragraphs that are written, and really this passage in chapter 25 in the Bible is about all we know about Festus. He wasn't as cruel and merciless as Felix, yet he does still keep Paul imprisoned, a political prisoner, and completely unjust. So he still wasn't a good dude. Next up, we've got Herod Agrippa II. In our story, he's called Herod, but if you're a Christian, you know the story. You know Herod's not really a good name in the Bible. Okay, so why don't we just show Herod's family tree, if we can pull that up. There you go. So the character in our story, you see that at the bottom left there, is Herod Agrippa II. But let's go up to his great-grandfather, Herod the Great. Now, that great, it's kind of a misnomer. He was kind of the opposite of great, especially if you were a mother in Bethlehem. Herod the Great was the famous murderer of babies in Bethlehem. When he found out that the Christ was born in Bethlehem, he was so terrified and anxious that there would be a rival king, even though he was a toddler at the time, he just said, "Murder them all." And so on one terrible night, the soldiers marched through town and ripped babies from their mothers and killed them. That's Herod the Great. You can see below Herod the Great, there's Herod Antipas. And he's the one that when you read the gospel stories, the accounts of Jesus' life, he's the one that you read about. And Herod Antipas, he is the one who had John the Baptist's head chopped off for testifying against him, served his head on a platter at a dinner party. A very pleasant man. John the Baptist was a cousin of Jesus, and that was a foreboding of what was to come. Herod was also responsible, or partially responsible, for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Then we go down a level, you see Herod Agrippa I. This is the father of the Herod of our story. We talked about him earlier in the story of Acts. He appears in Acts chapter 12. In Acts chapter 12, how does he appear? He brings the sword to James. So he's the first murderer of an apostle in the Bible, murders James, tries to do the same thing to Peter, but Peter gets out because of an angelic jailbreak. But still, Herod Agrippa I, once again, not a good dude. Then you have Herod Agrippa II, or Agrippa of our story. So he comes from a very long line of really bad dudes. Now we're going to leave this family tree up on the screen. You can see Drusilla was his sister. So she also comes from this same family tree of murder, adultery, and incest. And then you come to Bernice, who also appears in this story. Bernice was the sister of Agrippa. She was also the wife of Agrippa. She had just left her other husband, like she left a real husband for her bro. I mean, that had to have made for some seriously weird dinner table conversation. Like, oh, how did you guys meet? Well, kind of always knew each other. So that's Herod and Bernice. Bernice, again, having left her husband for her brother. So these are the ignoble nobles who will decide the fate of God's messenger, who's been in jail now for 2 years. God's messenger is the Apostle Paul. He's been left in prison first by Felix, now by Festus, and he's 54 years old at this point. He's been walking with Christ for 20 years. So now you have the characters of the story. We're going to read chapter 25. We're actually just going to read, for starters, one verse, because this verse paints the entire scene. Acts 25, 23. The book of Acts is the story of the early church. Here's what it says. It says, so on the next day, the story's been kind of building up to this. Festus, the governor, tells Agrippa, the king, man, you got to hear this guy named Paul. I mean, this guy's crazy. I mean, he's got the story, and starts telling this story. And Agrippa says, I want to hear the guy's story. And so on the next day, they set it all up. Agrippa's ready to hear the story. Verse 23. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. I'm one of those people that when I read a story, I kind of picture the story playing out in my mind. Does anybody else do that? So I want to help you do that with this story. Okay, this, what should have been a trial in a courtroom for the Apostle Paul, who's now been sitting without an actual sentence pronounced against him. What should have been a trial in a courtroom is actually an event in an auditorium. And it says that the people came with great pomp. And so I want you to picture the kings, the queens, the nobles, the prominent city leaders parading into this auditorium and taking their seats. And I want you to picture Festus and Bernice and King Agrippa coming in with royal crowns on their heads and royal robes. I picture Agrippa holding a scepter in his hand, and they're probably the last ones there. And it says the prominent men of the city, so the wealthy business owners and probably donors, and the people, all the who's who of ancient Palestine. And all of this area, they're all present. The military leaders are there. And so picture them there with all the markings of importance, and then hear the sounds of the trumpets and the drums. This is an event. This is a show. This is all the pomp and circumstance. And then you have silence. And then you have Festus standing up. And it says he called for the prisoner. I imagine him standing up and saying, "Bring forth the prisoner." And I picture a Roman centurion, an army officer, just sort of kicking the Apostle Paul out into the middle of this arena, this audience hall, this auditorium. And later in his speech, he'll talk about wearing chains, whether they were on his hands or his feet or both, we don't know. So I picture this 54-year-old man stumbling to the floor, dirty and worn and disheveled from 2+ years of imprisonment, but mentally and spiritually sharp. It's quite a contrast when you picture it like that, isn't it? I think it's fascinating that Luke uses the word and even seems to emphasize with this word pomp this scene. He says they came out with great pomp. And an English speaker would recognize the source of this Greek word. Greek was a language that Luke was writing in. The Greek word for pomp is fantasia, from which we get the English word fantasy. Luke is communicating something to us. He's saying that all this pomp and circumstance, all this stuff that people, these shows of importance, these seats of honor, these royal robes, these incredible crowns, and the jewels and the music and all the festivity that was meant to communicate, we are the people that matter. God's estimation of that is very different. God's estimation of that is that it's all fantasia. It's all fantasy. It's all a Clash of Clans video game that doesn't matter at all in the end. Reality, driving reality, is completely different. It's not that it's not real. They really did have this show. They really did wear these things. But at the end of the day, the only reason any of us knows any of their names is because they shared a few minutes in history with a 54-year-old handcuffed Jew. And so, pomp and circumstance. That's the scene. And what this sets us up for is really the theme of the passage, which is this: what really matters in life is not what appears to matter. And what doesn't appear to matter matters significantly. Let me say that again, because this is the theme of the passage. What really matters in life is not what appears to matter. What they thought mattered was their pomp and their circumstance. It didn't matter at all. What doesn't appear to matter, a disheveled and dirty, handcuffed Jew in prison, what doesn't appear to matter matters significantly. He's the one who's been changing lives for all these thousands of years for the good. He's the one whose letters and writings have persisted and established this church and this global movement called Christianity, with people of every tongue, tribe, and nation making a difference in all eternity. He's the one who made the difference, and yet he didn't appear to matter at all. Things are not as you appear. And you think about your life. What does it look like? It might look like your life is falling apart. Things are not as they appear. Or it might look like, hey, you've got it made because you're on top of the world and you're the CEO, or you're the one with all the money and everything's just going great and cruising along. Well, be careful, because the pomp and circumstance of this world is all fantasia. We have to be very careful. Earthly realities are real, but heavenly realities are driving realities. What's the driving reality of your life right now? What's the driving reality? A different way to ask this question is, what feels more real to you? Your problems or the God who answers prayer? What feels more real to you? Your shortages of time and money and energy, or the God who lavishly and generously provides for his children? What feels more real to you? Your earthly status or your heavenly status as a son or daughter of the Most High God through faith in Jesus Christ? Which one feels more real to you? If we live our lives by what our eyes see and what our ears hear and what our bodies and hearts feel, we'll have a distorted reality and therefore also a distorted lives. But if we live by God's unseen reality, if we fix our eyes on heavenly realities, our lives, rather than being distorted, will actually align with the truth of God and leave an eternal impact. Is that what you want in your life? And so you can't pay attention to what your eyes see. Some of us in this room, this very morning, you're discouraged because of what your eyes see. And I want to encourage you this morning that what you're seeing with your eyes is not the driving reality of your life. The driving reality of your life is a God who gave his only Son for your sins and raised him up again. And today he's alive and he lives for you and he's praying for you at this very moment. That's reality. What appears to matter doesn't really matter, and what doesn't appear to matter matters significantly. So let's come back to our passage and continue with the story. And so they kind of talk back and forth, and Paul is set up now, just about set up to tell his story. Chapter 26, let's pick it up. The event in the auditorium proceeds. So Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand. I picture maybe that centurion's unlocked his handcuffs. I don't know. But he stretches out his hand. He makes his defense. He says, "I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa. I'm going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you're familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." Okay, so here's the most amazing thing about this story so far to me. The most amazing thing about this story is that the happiest person in the room isn't the who's who, the people in the seats of honor. The happiest person in the room is the one wearing chains. Verse 2, he says, "I consider myself fortunate to appear before you, King Agrippa." That word fortunate is normally translated as blessed or happy. Just think about that. Could you say that? I'm so happy that I get to testify before this descendant of Christian killers. Paul was seeing with a completely different reality. Paul's happiness in life was in a friendship with Jesus, and it overflowed in getting to share that friendship with Jesus with other people. Your happiness in life, you will not be happy in life outside of a friendship with Jesus, first of all. And then second of all, if that friendship with Jesus isn't overflowing into the lives of other people. Paul is happy to be in this moment. This is what I live for, man. This is why I'm in chains. This is why I'm here. I want to testify. He's not worried about the sores on his wrists or his ankles. He's not worried about the fact that he can't go visit loved ones. He's not worried about the injustice that he suffered or the fact that he's probably prayed 10,000 prayers to be rescued from this prison and they haven't yet gone answered. He's not worried about these things because he's seeing with a different set of eyes. And he's the happiest person in the room. In contrast, these who's who, none of them are happy. And you know why we know that? Because you look at their lives. You look at their lives. Why are they having to murder every rival to their throne? Because they can't rest secure. Why are they trading their spouse for a new spouse and a new spouse and a new spouse? Every time they get tired of one, they go for another. Why? Because they're restless tyrants and loveless monarchs constantly chasing happiness at the end of a broken dream somewhere under a rainbow, and they never seem to find it. The pomp and circumstance isn't doing it for them. It's all fantasia. And if you're here this morning and you feel that sense of dissatisfaction inside of you, I just want to ask, are you on that treadmill of chasing satisfaction in the things of this world? It's not going to work. Paul defined his happiness, his blessedness in life, not on his circumstances. He defined his blessedness, his happiness in life in unseen realities. And that is why, with chains around him, he can say, "I consider myself fortunate, happy, blessed." What makes you happier than anything else in the world? That's your foundational reality right there. That's your driving reality. And I hope it's an unseen reality because every other form of happiness can be taken away. So let's keep reading. Actually, before we keep reading, I want to come back to the characters because I began by introducing their story, but actually I'd like to kind of illustrate what we've just talked about. I'd like to illustrate this idea that all their pomp and circumstance was really all fantasia. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to view their history not through the lens of the pomp, not through the lens of everything that we've just talked about, but rather through the lens of history and eternity. So let's walk back through these characters. Why don't we start with Felix? Felix. Remember Felix? He was the first governor. He was there in chapter 24 before he handed it off to Festus, the cruel murderer of thousands. Well, that most beautiful woman in Palestine didn't make him happy. He divorced her. Divorced and married 3 times before he died. He also didn't get to keep his throne. He was recalled from his throne in disgrace, actually sentenced to death. And the only reason that death sentence was not carried out because his brother knew people in high places made an appeal to Caesar Nero and saved him at the last moment. But this cruel murderer of thousands who did whatever he wanted whenever he wanted, because that's freedom, right? This cruel murderer died in disgrace. Next up, we have his wife Drusilla. Drusilla, this is sad, fascinating, but sad. She had the misfortune of being in the city of Pompeii on November 23rd, 79 AD, the city where that famous Mount Vesuvius erupted, sending 1.5 million tons per second of molten material flying into the air, a blast as powerful with thermal energy as 100,000 atomic bombs that were dropped over Hiroshima, sending lava into the city at 482 degrees Fahrenheit and burying the entire city of Pompeii beneath 82 feet of volcanic ash. Drusilla was 41 when this happened, and she was still beautiful. She and her only son perished in the flames of Pompeii. So you have Felix and Drusilla. Next up you have Festus. Again, we don't know much about Festus except that he died in office. How and when he died was not important enough to survive. Next up, we have Agrippa, that infamous Herod Agrippa. Agrippa died childless at the age of 64, which is a really bad thing when you're a king and your dynasty depends on you having somebody to pass it off to. Died childless at the age of 64, and the supposed dynasty that began with Herod the Great ended with Agrippa II. And then we had his wife Bernice. Well, she left her husband for Agrippa, and then from Agrippa she hopped to someone else and someone else. The last lover that we know about in history was a Roman warrior named Titus, who became a Roman emperor. But as soon as he became emperor in Rome, he dismissed of his lover Bernice. She disappears from the pages of history, age 51, her best years behind her. Now, what does all the pomp and circumstance matter for now? And what is all the status and significance and promotion and things that we're chasing after? What do those things matter in the end? I mean, I have a hard time remembering who won the Super Bowl last year. We don't even remember, you throw out old, really famous names like Bart Starr, and most people in the room are like, who's that? I mean, a few of you know, like old famous quarterback, okay? So we don't remember these things. They don't matter. And this is just like within a century, 2,000 years later, the only reason we know these people is because they came across this man named Paul, who lived a life as though he understood what truly mattered. What appears to matter doesn't matter at all. And what doesn't appear to matter matters significantly. And so what happens as this story progresses is the Apostle Paul tells his story. Now, we read that story in chapter 22. Paul's story is retold 3 times in the book of Acts because the theme of the book of Acts is the eternal impact that you can leave when you tell your story. I'm not going to read the whole story of the Apostle Paul again, since we did that just a few weeks ago. But he does tell the story of how he was on his way to murder some Christians, met Jesus on this road to Damascus. On his way there, had a complete life change, transformation. Everything's different. Jesus gives him a new commission, and he says, now your commission is to open the eyes of the blind, to to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to the power of God. And he tells this whole sweeping story. And then we'll pick it up in verse 24. And we'll keep on reading and kind of close out the chapter here. It said, as he was saying these things in his defense, telling his story, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. You're crazy. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, and I am speaking true and rational words. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. Okay, so in other words, he's saying this isn't like irrational, this idea that somebody rose from the dead. This wasn't done in a corner. Like you can go there today, there's an empty tomb. And he's going on and talking about the actual material evidence for resurrection. And so, but here's the irony that I want you to pick up on. The irony I want you to pick up on is that this man who's living in Fantasia, this man who's living for the honors and the accolades of this world, who thinks in this moment, I'm one of the most important people in this room. Look at my position. He looks at the person who actually understands reality, the Apostle Paul. He looks at the person who's actually seeing what really matters, and he's calling that person crazy. The irony is that the one who calls Paul crazy is actually crazy. I think a good contemporary example of this is with Kanye West. You guys follow any of this recently? Kanye West, this rapper, and he gets born again, and now he's like rapper for Jesus. We're talking about a guy who, like, a few years ago was saying things like, I am God. Didn't know if you knew that, but I'm God. I mean, I created you? Like, what did you even mean by that? I am God. Now he's saying, Jesus is God, and he's my king. And people are like, whoa, you crazy, man. I'm like, well, wasn't you crazy before? like Jesus actually made you sane. But here's the deal, and this is the point of these few verses. If your life is defined by heavenly realities, people will think you're crazy. If your life is defined by heavenly realities, people will think you're crazy. And it might be because you say crazy things like, hey, Jesus is the Son of God. Or, hey, you actually need Jesus in your life to experience forgiveness of sins and have eternal life. And without that, you don't get that. I mean, in this world, that's a crazy thing to say. Or maybe it's because they just don't get you. Maybe it's because you're like the Apostle Paul. You're actually like standing in prison, and you're like, I consider myself fortunate. Maybe it's in the midst of your prison, you actually have joy. Maybe it's in the midst of your darkness, you actually see light. Maybe it's like when the world's looking at you and they're like, that person has no reason for happiness, and you have the joy and the gratitude of Jesus just overflowing. You could fill like 13 gratitude journals. They don't get you. Maybe it's because God's called you to take a risk of faith, and when you take that risk, that leap of faith, they're like, what is that person doing? Because they don't see the one you're following because he's invisible, but you see unseen realities, and you've staked your happiness there. But if your life is defined by heavenly realities, there are going to be times when people think you're crazy. Anyone ever thought you were crazy before because you love Jesus? So let's finish out the story. Verses 27 through 29. It says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? So he doesn't stop. He's like, you just call me crazy, but I'm just going to keep going for this. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. I love it. I love the idea of a chained criminal saying to a monarch, you should actually be jealous of me. I mean, he says it humbly. He doesn't say it like that. But Paul understands his situation and their situation clearly. And here's the idea here. Once God has opened your eyes, he immediately calls you to open others' eyes. Once God has opened your eyes to what really matters and what really doesn't matter, your calling in life is to open other people's eyes, because there's Festuses and Felixes and Bernices out there who think you're crazy because you're living for reality when they're the crazy ones living for things that won't be remembered in a decade, much less eternity. Once God opens your eyes, your calling in life is to open others' eyes. And how could we be so cruel as to keep this in? God didn't open your eyes so you could enjoy the view. He opened your eyes so that in enjoying the view, you could share that view with others who so desperately need it. So your calling in life is to open other people's eyes. Are you doing it? And how do you do that? Well, the way you do it is the way Paul did it and what we've been talking about, and that is through the sharing of your story. The sharing of your story. So earlier, David talked about this in our announcement time as he gave a little bit of a recap this week over our Tuesday night event we called Stories and Songs, where we had people from our congregation, and I can see some of your faces out there, some of you who shared your story. But that's what we did, because we believe there is so much power in the telling of your story. There's power for those who believe and for those who don't believe, but there's power in the telling of your story. And so we gathered together and we told these stories, and we heard the story of Christy Susan. We heard the story of the way Christy, and I watched Christy fight for years and years and years and years to save her marriage. And when it became impossible and when it wasn't going to work out, she said on Tuesday night, she talked about how she chose to walk away from a long, protracted court battle over money and assets. And rather, if the divorce was going to happen, she was going to trust her future to God. And when she did, in her words, she said, when you might have expected a church to reject a divorced person, this one rallied around me. She talked about the people in this spiritual family who supported her with words of encouragement, supported her with a place to stay, sometimes groceries, sometimes a little bit of dough to pay the bills, a little bit to get by, but prayer, support, encouragement gave her what she needed. And today, Christy is standing strong on 2 feet. You can see her right there. She's real. And then we heard the story of Jessica and Austin. And Jessica stood up and so boldly, vulnerably, bravely shared about the lowest moment of her life after she'd slept some nights in a car. She'd lost her children for a short time to CPS, and she'd had suicidal thoughts. But she knew she had to give her life back to God, and she started coming to church and coming consistently, and she recommitted her life to Jesus, and at the same time brought her atheist boyfriend, Austin, along with her. In short order, Austin experienced the Holy Spirit, was saved. They were both baptized together. And if you were here that Sunday, you saw that right after the baptism, both of them sopping wet with baptismal waters and the love of their spiritual family, Austin pops a knee and proposes to his girlfriend. I think, what is this, the 8-day anniversary of your wedding? Now they're happily married 8 days in, right? But hey, we'll take it. And their kids are living with them in a stable, loving family environment. This because of the support, prayers, and faith of God's people. Then we heard of God's mission work around the world and what he's been doing in Africa. And Pastor Chola shared about how he was minutes from death when the Lord spared his life, healed him completely. And then we heard from Pastor Ronnie Mathaney's testimony. And if you've been a member of this church, you've heard this story, but it's been this long, long court battle where the court sought to seize their property, seize their assets, and through corruption, steal millions of dollars and destroy their ministry. They didn't know if it was going to make it, but through your prayers and through your financial support of this mission to keep it alive when everything was being taken away, he stood up and he said, the settlement has been decided, it is firm, and the crooks are going to jail. And Ronnie told me personally, because of the outcome of all of this, not only will the crooks no longer be able to extort other people because of our example that's now made national headlines in Kenya, but on top of that, we'll be able to reach 2 times the number of pastors with our ministry than we were able to reach before any of this ever happened. And then we heard Pastor Norland, our missionary in Cuba, share his story. And there is a true movement of the gospel happening in communist Cuba. It's a beautiful, wonderful, incredible thing. They're on harder times economically than they've ever been, he says. And yet God is moving. He told a story of how just last year they saw 1,000 people saved and baptized through their ministry. Every single day. Every single day, they see 2 to 3 new house churches planted. And what Pastor Norland said in the video, translated from Spanish to English for us, what he said in the video was that every statistic is a story. And he told the story of prison inmates giving their lives to Jesus. He told the story of alcoholics having their lives transformed. And this is happening all over Cuba. And he said, "Thank you, Wellspring Church." Just like that. He's my friend. I love that guy. Okay, I'm not making fun of you, Norland. I think it's awesome. All right, so that was Pastor Norland. After that, we heard Chris Adams speak, and he shared, again, bravely and vulnerably of how he's had a lifelong struggle with a spirit of rejection and how in his early days this manifested as, isn't it so cool we have a church where people will talk about this kind of thing and we don't have to hide it? And he just openly stood up in front of all of us, and he said, talk about overcoming spirit of rejection, be able to talk about it in front of all those people. And he talked about how it started out in his young days. It manifested as perfectionism. If I just perform, people will love me. And then it manifested a complete opposite way. He became prodigal and turned to drugs and substance abuse. It overcame that, gave his life to Jesus, got married, but that spirit of rejection wasn't quite done in his life. And it started to wreak havoc in his marriages. No matter what his wife Haley did, no matter what his wife Haley said, he just couldn't believe that she actually loved him and would actually stay with him. And so he signed up to receive extended prayer in one of our, what we call freedom sessions. And so we signed up for it, received that extended prayer, and he describes it as a 180-degree difference in his life and his marriage. His wife Haley describes it as night and day, and his life has been completely different, and now their marriage is happier than it's ever been. We also heard Clint Riddle share his story, and Clint's story, for those of us, there's Clint, and Clint and Hannah received just an incredibly painful diagnosis for their son who has Duchenne's disease. It's kind of like a form of muscular dystrophy, and we're praying for healing. And you know what? We're trying our best to believe for healing, right? I think what happens in these things is you believe a ton in the early days, and it's harder to keep believing. But one of the greatest evidence of continuing to believe is you just keep praying. And so we're praying and we're supporting them. But in the midst of walking through this, he talked about the way people brought them meals and people came and they supported them, they encouraged them. And he talked about the power of community and how it worked and helped to transform their experience and to bring light into their dark season. And then, last of all, we had Chuck and Christina Wong. And Chuck and Christina, and they told story after story. They told stories of financial breakthrough, of relational miracles. But the one that stands out to me, Chuck, was the death sentence that she received when doctors found tumors in his colon. Colon was covered, blanketed in tumors. And he was told by many people, this is the end, you're not going to make it, you're not going to make it. And I've watched Chuck, he's on our healing teams. It's got to be hard to pray on the healing teams when you have something that's not healed yet. And yet so faithfully he did. And not just that, but at the end of it, I always saw him, people would come up afterward and they would pray over him, and he would ask them time and again to pray for his healing. I saw it happen week after week. And so this process of pray for healing, go to the doctor, you still have tumors. Pray for healing, go to the doctor, you still have tumors. Doctors, tumors, same thing happening again and again. Well, the most recent time, they pray for healing. He goes to the doctor, and to the doctor's bewilderment and amazement, not only did the tumors not spread, they were completely 100% eradicated. He says, so when do I need to come back for my next checkup? And they say, you don't need to come back for 10 more years. You're that completely healed and restored. Now let me just ask you a question. Which story would you rather have? The story of one of these friends of God overcoming through the power of Jesus' resurrection, or the story of one of these who's who from a couple thousand years ago that nobody actually knows their names today? Whose story would you rather have, Christy or Drusilla? Bernice or Christina Wong? or any of the rest? I think the answer is obvious. I think the answer is obvious. None of these stories that I just shared, none of you are royalty. These aren't the stories that necessarily make the evening news, but then again, good news usually doesn't. The stories they're telling in heaven are the stories of those who overcome divorce and despair and injustice and death through the power of Jesus' resurrection. This is the foundational, this is the driving reality of our lives. It's not fantasy, it's real. It wasn't done in a corner. Jesus Christ really came, lived, died again for our sins. 3 days later, he rose again. And because he rose again, he's still alive, and his story is being written through your story. He's living his life through you today, and the story of Jesus is still being written through your church. For you to tell your story is to tell his story. That's the story they're telling in heaven, and it's the one worth telling on earth. Let's pray.